So today's session is just an intro. The AZ-900 certification is kind of like an overview of the entire Azure landscape. And my name is Barkha Herman. I work for Microsoft, and I'm going to be presenting this session. I do have some colleagues in this room today, Andres and Rodrigo. Oh, where's Rodrigo? And Luis. They're all, experts in different areas. We're all experts in different areas because Azure Cloud is a huge beast, and nobody can really know everything. So we're all going to try and give you as much information as we can. And also, we'd love to hear from you on what we want to do, what you want us to do next, as far as where your interests lie. Okay? All right, so I want to start with the free account. So for those of you who haven't signed up or never used Azure, there's an opportunity to get a free account. So the URL is, I don't have the URL here. The URL is azure.microsoft.com en-us free. And if you go there, you can sign up for a $200 for a 30-day trial, and you can start using Azure right away. So I wanted to start with that, so for those of you who've never tried, at least have an opportunity to start. And all you have to do is sign up. After the 30 days is over, you can set up a pay-as-you-go account, but it gives you an idea of what kind of consumption you might have, what kind of patterns or whatever, so you could start using it right away. Okay, so there's a few terms that you'll hear a lot in the context of cloud, and I wanted to talk about a couple of them. So some of them are high availability, scalability, elasticity, agility, fault tolerance, disaster recovery, global reach, customer latency capabilities, predictive cost consideration, and security. So these are the things that all the clouds, it's not unique to Microsoft, all the clouds claim to provide. And I think that by going over some of the other slides today, you'll see how this is covered.
Barkha, you have the audio going, recording?
Yes. I want to make sure. Maybe? Yeah, it's, yeah. All right, audio check. Okay. And then a couple of concepts that, why an enterprise should be using cloud. So economies of scale, I think the classic example here is, the assembly line creation. The Ford Motor Company made the motor car accessible to everyone. Back in the day, I used to work for a company where we co-located 21 servers. So it was our equipment hosted at the service provider, and it was, I think, $10,000 a month was the bill, and I actually moved all of that to Azure. And it went down to maybe $1,200 a month. And so that's economies of scale because, even though we had 21 machines, they were underutilized. They were sometimes utilized. There were peak times. And one of the things that cloud does really well is economy of scale. So. And then there's this concept of capital expenditure versus operating expenditure. So capital expenditure is, you buy your servers. Again, one of the companies that I worked for, First Data, they had every server that they bought, they had to have a primary and a backup because they did, OLTP, credit card processing, that kind of stuff. But they bought 4. And the 2 were reserves. They were backups in case one of the servers went down. So every machine that they bought for their production environment, they bought 4 of them for redundancy. And so you can imagine the cost involved in that. And so we come now to the operational expenditure model. where that cost is transferred to companies like Microsoft, because they're the ones spending the money on the infrastructure. So you guys don't have the capital expenditure, they're incurring it, and you're just paying usage fees. So that's a paradigm shift for businesses, and it's a good one. So I want to talk a little bit about, and so this is a question in the AZ-900. So I want to talk a little bit about the three types of clouds. So you have the public cloud, the private cloud, and the hybrid cloud. So when I was talking about the co-located 21 servers, that's a perfect example of a private cloud. So we created our own cloud. We had our own appliances, firewalls and network, whatever. Yes, it was co-located, but it was our servers. Nobody else had access to it. That's an example of a private cloud. And there's a very good reason to have that. And there's a lot of things that can be put in the public cloud. So public cloud is no capital expenditure. You don't have to buy a server. You don't have to upgrade. Agility. So you can scale up and down based on needs. So if you know that Friday is your busy time, every Friday the sales go up, you scale up on Fridays, and Monday through Thursday or Saturday, Sundays, you use less, you scale down. So that's a public cloud model. There's disadvantages to public cloud also. It's publicly accessible, so perfectly good for certain scenarios, and for certain things you may want a private cloud. And of course, the hybrid cloud has the flexibility of both. So when you combine public and private, and also, so how many of you have used AWS? Right. So AWS started. They were the first ones to come out with this whole. They were way ahead of everyone else in the industry. Came up with this whole cloud computing concept. But when they started, it was all IaaS, right? So if you wanted to rent machines, you deployed VM. And PaaS has become, so there are three flavors, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So IaaS is when, an example would be a VM, where even though the equipment is hosted by the cloud provider, you own the equipment, you have access to it, you do things, you have maintenance responsibilities for it, and you have your own access and things like that. And there's a lot more complexity to it. I'm kind of dumbing it down because I have 40 slides to go through. And we will be going into it in detail. So platform as a service is the other option. So I think even with AWS, storage is something that is a PaaS service. So you can buy as much storage as you want or as little. And so on Azure, there's a lot more variety of PaaS services that are available. So for instance, you can use SQL Server that's shared, that's offered as a PaaS service. You can use websites as a PaaS service, and there's a ton more. And of course, software as a service is the third model where, so just so you know, in PaaS, you don't have any maintenance responsibility. You don't have to remember to put patches on the operating system and run, upgrade device drivers and things like that. Software as a service is the complete other end, where the entire software is controlled by the vendor. Even in a PaaS service, you may want to redeploy your code from time to time, and you control that. In SaaS, you don't. So an example of SaaS is Office 365, all of Google Suite. Those are SaaS services, right? So you don't control the machine. You don't care. You don't know when it's upgraded. You don't have to worry about patches, none of that. So this is just a slide comparing the three. IaaS offers the most flexibility because you have control over the configuration. PaaS is productivity focused because you don't have to worry about the maintenance and patching and all that stuff. And SaaS is a pay-as-you-go service, and typically there's a subscription model for it, and it's static subscription as opposed to usage-based subscription, which is typical for IaaS and PaaS services, right? So you pay the same monthly fee for whatever, your email hosting or things like that. And here's a interesting chart of what the responsibilities are. So on-premise, you are responsible for application data, runtime, middleware, OS, virtualization, servers, everything, right? In an IaaS, infrastructure as a service, you are still responsible for application data, runtime, middleware, and OS, but you're not worried about the virtualization, servers, storage, networking. In platform as a service, as I mentioned before, you still have to be responsible for your application and your data, and everything else is taken care of by the vendor. And software as a service, you are not responsible for any of that. You're just a consumer. I'm going to really go briefly over the whole concept of regions. So when you deploy services in the cloud, you can distribute it globally, and this kind of goes on to one of the points in one of the early slides that we made, global availability. So let's say that if you have a office in California and one here, if you have your data center here, then the California people may have trouble accessing it. So one of the advantages of having a cloud provider such as Azure is that it has all these regions around the world, and they just opened their first Africa data center, which is awesome. So you can deploy your software and data everywhere around the world. And we have one company that is a global company, and because their usage pattern actually is that people use their services from 9 to 5. So what they actually do is they have their servers deployed around the world, and as the time changes, the servers are paused at 5 o'clock in time zones, and other servers come online. So they're consistently turning on and off servers following the sun, which is kind of interesting thing you can do with the regions. And also, there are 3 special regions, and this is because of legalese and other stuff. So there is an Azure Gov Cloud, and which is located in North America, and it actually has some restrictions because of government contracts. So if you do work for an organization that deals with government, we have FedRAMP certification, and also there's a China and Germany region as well. There's this concept of pairing. So if you actually use certain services, if you say, hey, I want to make it geo-redundant, it automatically creates a pair in a predetermined region. So for US East, it's West, and so much. I won't go too much into it. Again, there's a lot more to this story, and I'm trying to keep it like super high level. So also, another story, we have one of our clients is, I think, one of the Latin American countries, and they don't have a data center in the country. So the closest data center is one of their neighboring countries, and they're not political allies. So of course, they deploy their data in the United States as opposed to the neighboring countries. So geography matters, and so for instance, I think the U.S. companies cannot deploy their data centers in Europe because of legal issues. So there's all kinds of fun legal stuff that you deal with when you're dealing with multinational companies. So yeah, I think the Latin America data center is in Brazil, And so there are certain South American Latin American companies that don't want to deploy their data to Brazil, so they put it in US. So yeah, interesting. Interesting tidbit. So there's also this this idea of availability zone. So what Azure data centers usually are, when we say that we have an East US region, right? Let's say that you're deploying to East US. It's actually not one data center. It's actually multiple data centers around East US because we have built-in redundancy. And those are called zones. So we actually have different zones with different data centers physically. They're usually at least 100 miles apart. And so if one zone goes down, let's say there's a hurricane and one data center goes down, you still have availability even though it's still in East US and they're replicated. So there's this concept of availability sets, and so many services have availability sets. Especially VMs have availability sets, and what the idea here is that it's redundant. It's redundantly deployed to multiple data centers in order to provide resiliency. And so again, we don't have a single point of failure. You use availability sets to deal with domains. And there's this concept of update domains and fault domains. So update domains are pairings that happen for patching, right? So if I'm putting a OS patch on one, the update domain is still up, and the scheduling for patching is such that no two data centers within the same update domain will be patched at the same time, and that's by design. And then fault domains are physically separated locations. So, and you can use fault domains for resiliency by design. Update domains are automagic. So those are automatically maintained by us. Okay, so, and for the people who are new to Azure and come from the AWS world, this is one of the things that I think a lot of people find very useful. And it's this concept of resource groups. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually, because I've been talking for too long and it gets really boring. So let me see if I can share my screen here. And so there's this concept of resource groups. So the resource group is a logical grouping within a subscription. So I have a subscription here, and what I'm doing is I'm actually creating these resource groups. So for this is an example of resource groups that I've created for just my purposes for experimenting or proof concepts that I do. And you can see the MCSFUG AZ-900 resource group that I created. I'm going to switch off of that really quickly because I don't know. Yeah, it's got a subscription ID. Oh well. So this is the resource group that I deployed today for the purpose of this presentation. And you can see that I've deployed all kinds of different things here. And the idea is that this is just a logical grouping. Resource groups are, there's no cost to it. You can create a ton of them. And there's a limit. Yes, there is. I don't know what the limit is. Do you, Louis?
900 per subscription.
OK, so you can only deploy 900 per subscription. And the only reason we know this is because we have a client that tried to deploy more than 900. So, yeah. And the whole idea is that if you have an application that's whatever HR related, or application that's department X related and department Y, you can kind of group it and you can deploy it. And the other thing that resource group facilitates is something called deployment. So there's this concept of Azure Resource Manager deployment. So those are resource deployments within resource group, and I'm not going to go into it because we need to have a DevOps conversation, which is very separate from this conversation. Okay. All right. Getting back to this. Wait a minute. I am lost. Okay. So this is the hierarchy of deployment within Azure. So you have something called a management group. A management group can have multiple subscriptions. Each subscription can have multiple resource groups. And the resource group will have, oh, is it not working?
Because they cannot listen from the...
Oh, okay. All right. I'm going to have, can you guys hear me now? Okay. Sorry. Should have said something earlier.
That was fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think I'm a loud person, but what do I know?
Well, go back to the first slide.
Well, there's going to be a recording, so. So yeah, there is a hierarchy in Azure. And we used to start at the subscription level, and then we had resource groups because, silly us, we thought, one company, one subscription, but that's really not practical. So we have the concept of something called the management groups, where you can actually deploy things like policies. For all your ops people here, you can have limits on what can be spent. You can have policies. You can have all kinds of fun stuff. And then within that, you have subscriptions, and you saw my subscription ID and all. Then the resource group is underneath that, and within the resource group, you have your Azure services deployed. And so, for instance, in this, you have some SQL servers, some automation stuff, and a VM and network group and things like that. Okay, so now for the fun stuff. So there's a few categories within Azure. If you go to the Azure website, it'll actually have some categories. Compute is a big category. Part of what we do as software people is we want to figure out something, and in order to do that, we need to have some computation power. So compute services feature things like disk, processor, memory, networking, and OSs. Some of the examples of compute is virtual machines and containers. So, and for fun with containers, you should come to Lewis's session whenever that's going to be. So, Azure VMs are the most obvious ones. VM scale sets, and we talked about scale sets a little bit. Again, scale sets is when you deploy one VM, but there's another one deployed as a redundancy for high availability and fault tolerance. App services is like almost like your own little sandbox that you can play with, and app services segregate your resources from other companies' resources. And then, of course, there's serverless, which is functions. So whereas in a VM, even though you deploy a VM and you can start and stop it at certain times, you're still running it for the time that it's up. In a serverless scenario, you're just paying for every time the function is run. So your costs are even more reduced based on usage. So, question?
Can you power script all this stuff to commission the services?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So there's multiple.
Some kind of special power script, or is this?
Yeah, so you download the libraries for certain Azure, but yeah, regular power script, you don't have to. So there's multiple ways to deploy and tear down Azure services. As the gentleman in front mentioned, PowerShell is one of the ways. There's ARM templates for deployment, and you can do that. There's CLI, and you can also do REST APIs. You can do things programmatically. So there's multiple ways of building up Azure services and tearing them down. And then, of course, there's two flavors of containers. Azure Container Instances, which is a PaaS offering, and then there's the Kubernetes services. Azure Network Services. Let me share again my screen. And I actually did deploy a virtual machine here, so you can take a look at it. So yeah, here's a virtual machine, as you can see. Cosmos DB account, there's a SQL Server, storage account, some of these things. And it's, let's play with the portal, right? It's very easy to create any of these things. So when you go, this is the Azure portal. When you go here, you can see these are the categories. So we're talking about compute, containers, and we're going to go a little bit over some of these, not all, because there's a lot to it. But you could go to compute, and let's say we want to deploy a VM. And you can also select whether you want a Windows server, you want Linux, all kinds of flavors. I'm going to turn off some of these. And you'll see that there's a bunch of flavors available, right? And all these images come with different software already installed. So you can start one. I'm not going to deploy one because it takes a little bit, but I'm going to just walk you through. Let's say that we want a server with Visual Studio. So I'm going to pick this guy. Let's say create. And this is just to show you basically what you need to do. You need to give it a unique name, which hopefully that is. And for some reason, I'm very slow. And here's what we were talking about, regions. So these are the regions. There's a couple. And we can either deploy it with availability zone or sets. So we talked about zones and sets earlier. And you can change the size. And you set a username, password, which I'm not going to do because it's going to take a little bit of time. But well, let's do it. Why not? The password is password123.
You have to already have an account in order to have an administrator account?
So you don't have to be an administrator to log into the portal. The administrator can give you the ability to create resources or take it away. So obviously, if you are an administrator, you can create whatever you want. However, and we can go into a little bit of that role hierarchy.
You just made yourself, I guess, Barkha, an administrator.
Yeah, correct. So I'm just, so because I'm standing up a new VM, it has to have a login, right? So I'm making this up. So it's not, it doesn't have to be Barkha. It could be Philip, you know. I just like my name a lot.
But it does have admin rights.
On that view.
And then, you know, I'm not going to hit create because it's going to take a little bit. So I'm just going to hide this. And we're going to go. So that's pretty much how you would create it.
Do you offer hosting? Do they offer hosting? To host
So
a
what do
website?
you mean by hosting?
You know, to publish a website. Sure. Hosting. Sure.
Like, you know, do you offer configuration with like WordPress or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's all kinds of, yeah. So there's all kinds of images available from VMs. And you can also have a PaaS version of WordPress site also. And there's a lot of vendors who can create images and sell them on the Azure Marketplace. So you can create your own images and sell them. And there's a process for that. But, you know, not everything on that screen that we saw was Microsoft created. So, you know, other companies will create a VM image and sell it. So
The VM images for Azure, for the servers, are they core? Or are they, like, can you harden them and can you put just very limited things?
yeah. So
Like
there's
HIPAA compliant, I mean, I don't know.
yeah. There's different flavors of it, and because I'm a data architect, that's
You can
probably
grab the ones on the marketplace, but you can also create your own.
Your own.
custom image
Oh, okay,
as
that's
well.
what I wanted to know.
yeah. You can have custom images.
And we just publish it.
And then you, once you create your VHD, you upload the VHD into storage account, and then you create a custom image.
Yeah. So to repeat what Louis said, you can purchase the one that's already deployed, but you can create your own images. And you can create custom images and you can deploy that. And a lot of customers do that because typically when you are deploying images, VMs, you do have certain requirements and it's easy.
Yeah, the GP,
Yeah. So yeah, it would, you can create your own custom images and deploy it. So some of the network services, we have this concept of a virtual network. So this is a virtual network that you can set up that creates a boundary of your resources. There's a load balancer, there's a VPN gateway, there's an application gateway, there's a CDN. Moving on to data. So there's all kinds of data services available. So you can have structured data. You can have semi-structured data, or you can have unstructured data. So examples for structured data is sensor, financial data. Semi-structured data is typically NoSQL data, blogs, HTML, that kind of stuff. And then unstructured data, you know, PDF, JSON, JPEGs, videos. So storage services, one of the storage services, Azure Storage Services, I believe it's the cheapest service in Azure. So storage is cheap. You can either store data in blob storage, so files, PDFs, images, videos, that kind of stuff. You can have a disk storage. So this actually is the disk that is provided for virtual machines. You can have file storage. Fully managed, so this is a file share. You can create a file share. And also, you can have archive storage. So that's a cold storage. So in other words, it's the kind of storage that's a little slower to read, and it's cheaper because it's archive kind of data. So. And as far as the database services, we have Azure Cosmos DB that supports several flavors, including SQL API, MongoDB, Cassandra, Graph API. and adding more all the time. Yeah, and Azure SQL databases. So that's, a lot of people are familiar with Azure SQL. We also have a migration service. More recently, we've actually we do have a PaaS version of Postgres as well as MySQL, which is kind of nice. Again, and so there's IoT Central and Azure IoT Hub, and I'm sure that Dave will be happy to give a talk on that. He just got back from Pittsburgh, doing some talk on IoT. So yeah.
We have IoT workshop next Tuesday at the Coders Cafe.
All right. So Boca Raton Coders Cafe IoT workshop next Tuesday. Be there. And then, of course, we have big data analytics, Azure SQL Data Warehouse, so parallel processing for your warehousing data, and this is a re-architected version of data warehouse, so cloud native, highly efficient, and it can be paused and stopped and started again, so that's kind of nice. Azure HD Inside, it's fully managed open source analysis services, and also Azure Data Lakes. So this is, low cost, tons of data with lots of ability to access from different things for computing, such as Databricks and Kafka, Spark.
That uses a HDFS?
Yeah. So even the storage has an option to use SSD or high availability. And for all of these services, you can kind of configure what level of access you want. So there's always a premium option available if you want, solid state drives or just a low use data. So there's flavors available and everything. Trust me, I'm skimming through all this stuff, and each one of these bullet points that I'm going through can be at least a couple hours of talk. So yes. And then there is AI, artificial intelligence. So there's machine learning services and also Machine Learning Studio. Where is Rodrigo? And I'm sure that Rodrigo can have several hours talk on that, and hopefully he will soon. Serverless computing. So we talk about Azure Functions a little bit. So that's one flavor of serverless computing that's available. However, there is more. Azure Logic Apps. It's almost very similar to if some of you are familiar with BizTalk. So Logic Apps, UI-driven, tons of connectors. We have a lot of clients that are actually moving their BizTalk in-home to Logic Apps. Again, serverless computing, you pay as you go, pay as you use, basically. So, kind of a nice thing to have. And then, of course, there's Azure Event Grid, which is a fully managed intelligent routing service and uses pub/sub model. So we're getting to the infrastructure that Azure provides part of the session now. So let me pause and ask, what do you guys have any questions? Anything interesting?
One question: for person with AWS experience, it would be helpful to have a mapping between AWS services that we use currently and Microsoft services that we can use, to have some kind of a transparency or clarity, to understand if you have any gaps, or maybe you have something better than what we have in AWS.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point.
Recently a site in Microsoft that compares the services with AWS.
Yeah.
Like it's in the meetup group.
Yeah, if you can post it, that would be great. Yeah. And, I have like 10 versions of slides that'll compare specific services one at a time. But I get your point. It would be great to have, because Azure, there's just so many services. It's crazy to keep up with them. But it would be nice to have like a whole topography versus the AWS topography, right? So, and I don't know if that link does that. So.
It has every single service in Azure and AWS. I mean, some
Nice.
services might be different.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have stuff that AWS doesn't have and the other way around.
Right, yeah.
So, but it does give comparison.
Awesome, yeah. So Azure Advisor, it actually does a lot of, so if I log into my Azure service, the Azure Advisor comes up and says, hey, you could improve performance, you could improve security, or you could improve cost, and things like that. That's what Azure Advisor does. It kind of looks at all your services deployed and makes suggestions. Go ahead.
I have a question, but it might be a little technical.
Yeah, no worries.
The Azure Advisor, because I already have clients
Yes.
already online working. And sometimes I go on the advisor and it tells me something. It really works. It does
Yeah.
a lot of things. But it tells me to do something regarding security.
Yes.
And then I'm kind of afraid because I don't want to hit something and then the security goes and blocks something and do something and then my client calls, no, it's not working.
Yeah.
This could happen.
Yeah. So understood completely. So so the VM that I deployed, I have HTTP open, port 80 open, and I know my Azure Advisor is going to come in and say, hey, you've got a VM that's got this port open. And yeah, sometimes I'm using that. It's there by default. So are you looking for guidance on it? Or yeah, you do need to be careful. So your
performance under availability of resources, that's okay, you can just go
right.
But security you need to know it.
Yeah.
Well,
And
those recommendations that you see around security are based on Azure policies, and those policies are reviewed by security experts at Microsoft. So those recommendations will most likely not block your infrastructure. Although it's an advice, so it may be that depending on your scenario, you may not need those, and you can turn those off specifically. But just as it is going to be telling you like the best practices. For instance, if you have a storage account where it's publicly accessed and you have available port 80 instead of only enabling HTTPS, the advice is going to be telling you, hey, you have this storage account, and it may be okay because perhaps you have something like images open to a site or whatever, and you can definitely handle those and whether enable the policy or not, so that it's not always bothering you with the warning.
Yeah, and we are going to cover policy for like one slide, and you can customize some of the things, and some of the things will still pop up. So some of it is in your control. You guys had a question?
If you have a pre-configured hardened server, you shouldn't be able to have that problem rather than wait until the end and start tying things up.
Yeah.
If you have a port and it has only this thing's open, it's not a
Right.
web server, it's not an FTP, it's not,
Right.
I mean, you shouldn't have that problem.
Yeah.
Now, if you configure it like us, that we're displaying, obviously it's going to be standard wherever it comes out, and they don't so you can't move that to production. So you have to have some kind of
And that's where I think that cloud is a big umbrella, and then if you run the Azure Advisor on a dev subscription, you're going to find a lot of holes because you do want your developers to play with things and be able to experiment, but then it's a whole different policy when it comes to production environment or staging environment, right? You had a question in the back?
Yeah, I've got clients that are all working off the servers. I'd love to get them over to the cloud. Does Microsoft have resources dedicated to the migration for not the large scale entities, but the smaller scale, small business, small mid-sized businesses, where that's a painless endeavor? I mean, Office 365 seems to be claiming that market, which it's hard to differentiate at times. And it seems like SharePoint they're positioning SharePoint as the tool. But from what I can see, Azure's a much better product.
Right.
What's available?
I can't really tell you off the top of my head because I work with enterprise clients, but let me follow up and I'll post it on our user group if that's okay with you. And what size are we talking?
200 to 500 mounts, 200 to 250 employees.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's resources available for that size. If you're talking 1 or 2 machines, then it's a whole different game. But yeah, I'll venture to say that there is, and I'll find the resources for you. So awesome. Again, firewall. Azure does have a pretty decent firewall, and recommendations. More and more PaaS services are implementing firewalls. Not every service has it, but yeah, you can control who accesses even your PaaS resources. Network security groups are kind of neat. They're logical groups that kind of are create a boundary around your resources. So within a network security group, you can have free access, and it prevents outside services to access your services. Again, you can set rules for inbound, outbound ports, protocols, IPs. You can have multiple rules. Usually, if you create something like, let's look at my nice VM that I created here, and you will see that there should be a network security group. There you go. So this is deployed by default when you create a VM, and it'll do things that it thinks is logical for your machine. And again, I should probably do this. It has some rules by default, and of course you can alter it. So Azure uses a layered approach for security. If you ever get a chance to see their data center videos that they have on their data centers, it's amazing. They have physical security, identity access, perimeter, network, compute, application, and data. The data centers are just very neat. I think who's been to a data center? I think you have. Have you done a tour of their data center, Dave? Sam?
No, not yet.
Okay. Yeah. So they, like the disks, they have these bizarre policies. It's electrified fences and this and that, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, you can't even bring anything in or out, and all disks are actually destroyed, so that they cannot be caught. You cannot recover disk data or things like that.
Well, they just drop in a whole container, right? They order a container of servers from HP or something.
Yeah. So.
Drop it in and pull it out.
Yeah. The data center is one block, and it just kind of like plops, and everything is just. It's amazing. If you get an opportunity to watch a video, and I'll see if I can find one on the internet. It's just fascinating. Authentication and authorization. So Microsoft is very serious about security. So the concepts are authentication, authorization. I don't think I need to go over this with you guys, but they have Azure AD, and Azure AD does the authentication with for users coming into Azure. Has single sign-on capabilities. Has application management, so you can have application level security, B2B and B2C level security as well. Also supports multi-factor authentication. And finally, Azure Security. Anybody use Azure Security Center here? Yes. It's absolutely amazing. I don't have a demo for it. but it actually allows you to, and what we were talking about briefly is it allows you to define policies and runbooks. And so what you can do is on a subscription level or a management group level, which actually encompasses more than one subscription, you can define fine-grained security policies so that you can have your entire cloud, no matter whether it be some random developer deploying VMs or whatever, it applies those policies to everything. So, and it does more than that. It actually analyzes all the time. So not just at deployment time, and it'll report. And also there's some remediation available. So Azure Key Vault. So this is a vault where you can put your secrets and certificates and such, so that when you are, say, logging into an application or something, the secrets never leave Azure. So there's no attack possibility or things like that. It's not in a config file somewhere or whatever. So you can deploy something in a Key Vault. The developer can write the code, and they don't have to know to put something in a configs or whatever. So you can access Key Vault. And Key Vault is supported very widely from different services, including ARM templates. ARM templates can reference Key Vaults to access services. So even your deployment can rely on Key Vault. We talk a little bit about policies. So you can set Azure policies. So when you set a policy, it evaluates and identifies Azure resources that do not comply, provides built-in policy and initiative definitions under categories such as storage, networking, compute, security center, and monitoring. So here's an example of a policy. You can say, hey, as a dev, you don't want the storage account to be a certain size. So if you try to create a storage account that's larger than it, it'll deny it. Other things such as locations, maybe legally, the cloud user in the Latin American country is not allowed to create a subscription in Brazil or a resource in Brazil because that's the policy of the government. So that can be set by a policy. And there's a ton of samples available. Also, there's RBAC throughout AD. So everything is role-based, and you can deploy role-based security to pretty much all of Azure services.
Can you do that? Can you define those things for like physical roles, like for server, for DevOps, like for SOD?
Yeah. So that's
or in a workflow.
Yeah. So yeah, it's very interesting. So yeah, you can actually have. So DevOps is a whole different topic, and it's so rich that it should be its own talk. But yeah, you can define limits to who can do what. And typically, what we do for DevOps, for deployment especially, is we actually don't even use user logins because that's still vulnerable. We have something called service principals. So service principals have authority over deploying something from here to there, and they have very specific access. So I can have permission to run a pre-compiled deployment script. I can't change it, I can't edit it, and I can just run it. And it'll run it under the authority of a service principal so that it's not me, I can't log in and deploy something. So that's how that's used. But yeah, it's very well defined, and again, security is a whole different topic, and we should do a security session. So there's something called a blueprint. So it's a a blueprint is almost like a group of policies and all kinds of other resources in it. And what it does is it helps you, trace compliance and define more than one policy, sets and rules. And you can actually you can create a blueprint and deploy it, apply it to certain subscriptions or multiple subscriptions or management groups, and it'll take care of all of those things. It's very detailed and complicated, and I'm not going to go into it. Also, things like one of the requests I had was, can I limit the spend of my developers, because they stood up a data warehouse, went home for the weekend and came back and forgot about it, and that was, I don't know, $2,000 over the weekend because they were playing with something. These are the kind of things that are possible. So yeah, we have limits that you can set on billing, access control. So for instance, when you go to the Azure subscription, when I go to the Azure subscription, you'll see hundreds of things. You can limit what your developers can see, or other members based on role can see. So maybe QA can only see these 5 resources, and they can create and deploy those, and others can see more or less or whatever. Maybe some managers, you don't want them to be going in and editing some stuff. So
can you set up like work groups or?
Yes. Well, it's RBAC based. I don't know if it's work group based, so it'll have to be a role that you create. But it can be, so in Azure AD, you can implicitly create, a grant and give access. So in Azure AD, you can define additional groups, right? Subscription limits, you can set subscription limits, basically. Service health, so again, service monitoring, service health, resource health, and this is also available on each kind of service that you deploy. Azure Monitor is amazing. It actually analyzes, for each resource, it analyzes different data points, responds using alerts, gives you dashboard type visualization, and then you can also integrate it with other systems. And you can customize what it does, Azure Monitor. So. Azure has the highest number of compliance, certified compliances than any other cloud. So, and again, there's a whole page dedicated, so I'm not going to go into it. And that's it. Yay! I ran out of, so questions? Go ahead.
Power scripting for all this, or configure them, or?
Yeah, so PowerShell, yeah, you can use PowerShell to deploy just about everything in Azure. So yeah, the answer to that is yes. I don't know of any limitations. Do you know any, Andres?
Oh, so if you download the module, the PowerShell.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a module per service.
But any admin rights or any security that would not allow you to go?
So when you log in through your PowerShell, it's going to ask you to log in with your account. So whatever your account has, admin rights you have, that's what you're able to deploy with PowerShell. Yeah, so the role-based security filters down. And yeah, so when you actually try to deploy, whether you do it through Visual Studio, Visual Code, CLI, PowerShell, it doesn't, ARM template, it doesn't matter. When you try to deploy something, it's going to make you log into Azure, and it'll use your role-based security access to deploy anything.
You mentioned at the beginning that there's templates to configure stuff, but is there a optimization template or roadmap that shows you everything you configure to see if everything was correct? I mean, or it's just the server and that's it?
Yeah, so it's it's different for different service, right? So one of the things that we can go into is the pricing calculator. So Azure has a pricing calculator for each one of its services, and you can actually go in there and say, hey, what if I deployed X with this and that? So for VM, it would be how many cores, how much memory, disk space, what kind of disk space. For a SQL Server, it would be completely different. For a Cosmos DB, it would be completely different. For a storage, it would be completely different. For something like
is there an aggregator that told you you're spending the?
Yeah. So you can go to the cost center and do that too. Let me see if I can bring up. Yeah.
Can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of cost, for every resource that you create in Azure, you can create tags. Let's say I have 10 VMs that are used by HR department. You can create a label called department or cost center, and you can place the tag HR. You create another storage for those 10 machines, you use the same tag. So in your billing, you can see cost by whatever label you
put with certain artifacts.
Exactly, you can do that.
Yeah, so here's an example of what I'm using. Okay. It's not a lot. It actually gives you what my monthly cost would be for this subscription. And it gives you the breakdown of what each one is. And there's a whole API. So if you want to write some fancy dashboard based on, so anything that you can do on the portal, you can also do using REST API. You can do it using whatever, PowerShell and. Yep.
One more question, practical. We tried to migrate from data center, our production from data center to AWS, and here's the problem. Our application is designed for kind of like lots of transactions between web server and SQL Server. So as soon as we migrate, considering that AWS does not guarantee proximity of SQL Server and web server, any delays, any latency causes application performance problems. You mentioned resource groups, and how these resource groups are actually guaranteed that the resources physically or at least latency-wise will be kind of controllable.
Yeah.
It's a first question. Second question is, I understand that answer probably will be a little complex, but it would be helpful for us to compare apples and apples. Like, for example, you run Microsoft utility on our data center, check the latency, and then compare it based on your resource group, so that we can compare what we can expect without actually transitioning from our production to your resource group.
Yeah. So first of all, resource group is just logical. You can put in a resource group something in China and something else in Russia. Okay. So it's just a logical. What you want to do for that is region. So region guarantees geographical approximation, right? So proximity. So that's how you can kind of guarantee latency. And we have SLAs for everything published. So you can go and look at the SLAs for all our services. Second of all, yeah, there's a tool called SQL experimentation tool, and somebody correct me, but that's what it is. And it actually, what it does is it'll actually, what you can do is you can run a trace, X event trace on your production server. And then you can say, hey, what would it look like on a PaaS SQL? How would it look like? It'll give you compatibility, and it'll also give you some, approximation of timing. What is going to be more expensive? What is going to be less expensive time-wise and money-wise? So it actually, we have a tool that does that. I will remember to post that in the user group that we created. So you can play with it, and it's amazing. It's really a great tool to play with, and yeah. So there's some predictability. Of course, it's not 100% ever, but there are tools for that. So, anyone else?
You mentioned Azure Blueprints.
Yeah.
So I was having trouble. What's a typical use case scenario? Is that like the build of a server, or we're talking like a DevOps deployment?
So Azure Blueprint is to actually do governance to your entire organization. So let's say that you are going for SOC 2 compliance. So you can actually deploy a blueprint that's based on SOC 2, and then it has rules and policies based on storage and VMs and networking, appliances and everything. And so it'll actually run that blueprint against what you have and tell you where the gaps are and things.
So it's targeting your environment and not the code in the environment is my question, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So like a best practice template.
Yes.
That runs against your.
Yeah, and there's already pre-made ones, but of course you can create your own.
Right.
So,
Well,
yeah.
If you go into your Azure portal and just type in Blueprint, you can get all the information and more that you ever wanted.
Yeah. Let's see if we can look at the security center. And it's going to yell at my stuff always because I don't have it turned on. So it's yelling at me because I don't have agents installed in certain things. Because I'm always tearing down and putting up new things. And here's the monitor. I don't have anything set up either, so yeah. Oh well. All right, so I really don't have anything else for the evening. Do you guys want to make some announcements or for next? And we want to ask about.
You mentioned about somebody going to present IoT. When is that?
IoT. So that's Tuesday at Sendine Spaces. That's in Boca Raton. 6 o'clock, right? Or 6:30? 6:30. Yeah, it's this coming Tuesday, yeah.
I got 20 devices from Particle, so the first 20 that want to come into it.
Ah, so you get a device.
There's some prerequisites. You have to install a few things, so check out the website. Thank you, Barkha.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.